Hey there, glad to see everyone. It's me, the Habsburg historian, and it's time for Living That History. And this time it is a political post. If you can't handle any more political talk, and I don't blame you, tune out right now, but please follow anyway because there will be posts concerning a variety of topics. So, 2020 election. Is it over yet? No! It's not! And here's why. Sebastian Gorka said it best last Friday evening when, and I wish I could do it in this broadcast, but it's not my job. But he said, this needs to be explained so clearly that every neurosurgeon and truck driver in this country needs to understand what's going on. He's, of course, talking about the litigation for the recount. Interestingly, also, on that same Friday night, it seemed several members of the GOP actually grew a spine. Lindsey Graham, Utah's Attorney General, Ted Cruz, and many others have followed. They actually decided to help with the investigation, or at least recognize the fact that there were potential shenanigans. I mean, that's huge, because I personally expected every GOP member to just sort of bury their heads in the sand and go on being the seat warmers they typically are. Well, then we came to Saturday morning, 11:30 a.m. to be exact. And what happened? After there was finally some sort of support behind the president and this recount, the questions, not even the recount, but the questions of alleged voter fraud. What happened? Saturday morning, 11:30 a.m., nearly all the news outlets decided to call the race. Just like that. This includes Fox News, which liberals think is somehow a right-wing news organization, despite its personalities being just as biased, with a few exceptions in the early morning and some commentators in prime time. Fox News is not a pro-Trump organization. It is not even a pro-conservative organization. Some of its most prominent right-wing personalities from the past aren't even allowed on their airways anymore. Not at all. When was the last time you saw Ann Coulter, Michael Savage? They don't come on. There is no unbiased, let alone conservative biased cable news channel. None. The closest thing you'll find is Newsmax, which, although you can get it on cable in like the 1,000 channel range, it's mostly a free streaming app. That's what it was designed for. I'd encourage liberals, actually, who wish to understand the conservative point of view instead of just dismissing us all as a bunch of redneck goons, to check out Newsmax, because you'll actually see the thinking, the thought process behind many conservative issues. So, what to say about the media calling the election and the president's claims of voter fraud? Look, shenanigans aren't new. Despite what they're saying, that it never happens, it rarely happens, there's no historical examples, shenanigans happen. They don't typically happen in a national election, not in a general election. They happen in primaries all the time. But shenanigans aren't new. Voter fraud or cheating is not new. Nixon didn't call them out legally at all in 1960. You realize that that race is one of the defining points of voter shifting. He could have asked for a recount. He could have challenged it in court, but he was a young man in his early 40s, and he didn't want to put the country through that kind of chaos. Plus, in 1960, technology wasn't quite what it is. Now, in 2000, Gore brought his case to the courts, and they, kind of forced the hand of SCOTUS on a relatively moot point because, he wanted to count ballots again in certain precincts. Of course, those of us that are old enough to remember the dangling chads, people voting for Pat Buchanan instead of Al Gore. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, that's, you're an elderly Floridian, and, you probably can't even stand. There was a derangement about Pat Buchanan that was, similar to that about Trump. And that you accidentally vote for him instead of Al Gore, and then instead of asking for a new ballot, you just poke another hole in it, and then they don't understand why that was a problem. So anyway, here's the difference from what I see in 2000. First of all, we've got this Dominion voting machine malfunction, software issue, whatever it is. Okay. They won't really tell us exactly what happened, but it seems that in certain counties it was flipping votes. I've seen this happen. I've seen it happen with the computerized machines that they brought in after the 2004 election. You could either vote by ballot, shove it through a Scantron machine here in PA, or you had the chance to use this computer screen. By the way, after 2016, actually during the 2016 election, we were told to stay away from the computer because there was no paper trail. But I've seen it happen in precincts where people were trying to cast their vote on that computer screen several times. And of course, before you cast it, it shows you, okay, you chose these people. And they weren't the people that they chose, and they would go back and do it again, and go back and do it a third time, till they finally said, just give me the damn paper ballot. So, software is faulty. There's too many things that can go wrong, so now we're using paper ballots where you basically just have to fill in a box. What could possibly be the problem? Well, we see right now a disproportionate number of suspicious ballots. And I say suspicious because I'm not saying that they're necessarily fraudulent, but they're statistically suspicious. And the only reason they are is because despite a court order, multiple court orders, but particularly let's look at Philadelphia, inspectors or observers weren't allowed close enough to the ballots to see the count. Even if Biden is the true winner, the actions of the election officials that refused to let Republican observers close enough to see what was going on, it casts an unhealthy spirit of doubt against the results. Why? Why would they want to do that? There is also a statistical anomaly that is the large elephant in the room. I had to say elephant. That large elephant in the room to argue that the only 4 cities in the United States where Joseph Biden did not underperform Hillary Clinton are the only 4 cities where election officials couldn't give a straight answer as to how many ballots they had pending. And exactly what are these cities? Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, and Philadelphia. Okay. Polling precincts are supposed to have a judge of elections. He or she is the boss. A clerk, whose job it is basically to help the judge of elections. A majority inspector of elections, that's one who belongs to the party of the most registered voters in the precinct. And, most importantly, a minority inspector of elections, who is of the party of a minority of the registered voters in the precinct. That last position, the minority inspector of elections, was always crucial. It's one that I actually held for 6 years. And my grandmother, God rest her soul, did it for decades. We were the ones who were there to dispute any overvote and support any undervote. See, aside from the then 19 to 25-year-old me, most of these precinct officials tend to be older Americans, senior citizens. They also don't tend to repeat their jobs that often anymore. In fact, my precinct has had a different judge of elections every season for the last 6 years. Because of COVID, many of these positions were given to lower risk individuals. You can't have these very helpful elderly people sitting there doing the poll working when they're at high risk for infection. So, what do? They found replacements. Who are these replacements? People that hadn't done it before. See, it's not a job that takes a lot of brains, but it does take a lot of patience and endurance, and it's also a thankless job because nobody really appreciates it. It does take, however, a certain amount of experience, especially when it comes to a presidential election, and even more especially when it comes to a presidential election as close and as ridiculously different as this one has been. How many Philadelphia precincts had minority inspectors of elections? I want to know. How many? Well, we don't know. Nobody's actually asked that question. They're kind of just stuck on the Republican observers. They'd be Republicans there, by the way, the minority inspectors of elections, because Philadelphia precincts are going to be heavily Democrat. I, here in Lancaster County, was a Democrat when I was a minority inspector of elections, and the majority outside of the city were going to be Republican majority voters. So, obviously, the Democrat would have been the minority inspector of elections. The need for actual poll observers shot up in 2004. See, I actually thought it was outrageous at the time, and I listened to all kinds of snarky comments, more so than usual, because I was still serving then as the minority inspector. I'd hear people say how I was the Democrat spy, but my precincts were both in Lancaster County. One was in Manheim Township, and one was in Manor Township, and like I said, I was a Democrat then. And the two precincts in which I served were Republican registered voters, about 75 to 25%. And the races from 96 on to 04, that's how they pretty much panned out. I remember in 96, when we turned the machines around and tabulated the votes, and Dole had 3 votes to every one that Clinton had, and I thought, wow, maybe there really is, maybe it's not going to be the landslide that it was. And then we're there till 10 o'clock, we finish up, we post the results. By the time I get home and turn on the news, election's already over, Clinton won, Dole had conceded. But it was a heavily Republican area. In the 6 years that I served as minority inspector of elections, I challenged 8 votes. 4 of those votes were eventually tossed because they were not completed properly. That's called either a spoiled ballot or an overvote or a no vote. 4 of the votes were counted in part. Those 4 were actually military ballots. and I remember it very clearly. The reason they were kept in part was because the voter wrote in the name on the president and vice president line. It looks a little bit different than our ballots. The military ballots, at least at the time, was about the shape of an index card. It said president, vice president, line, and then it said Senate, line, Congress, line. And that was it. Well, 4 of them had come in, and they had written the president and vice president's name on the line, and then they had written Republican and Republican on the next 2 lines. So, couldn't count them. I said, nope, that's not a name. And, of course, we had to count the ones for president, but as the minority inspector of elections, they were ready to, award those senatorial and congressional votes. And I said, no, sorry, that's not a name. Has to be a name on the line. You can't write a party. These guys should have done a little more research and at least found out, who, the person, the individual was running. My personal favorite, though, of all the votes that I ever tossed out, or petition to be tossed out, was a provisional ballot that wasn't even completed. So somebody had come, they weren't registered to vote there, they were given a provisional ballot, they were explained, the judge of elections explained to this person that the way provisional ballots work is they're not usually counted unless it's close, and this person had actually handwritten across the ballot all of the Democrats who is running. And I remember because we had there was a big laugh, and of course, the majority and the clerk and the judge looked at me as though, you're going to challenge this, Mr. Kaufman? And no, we all had a laugh, and I said, yeah, can we frame that? Which, of course, we couldn't. It went in with the soiled votes. So now we have observers. This entire farce of an election will have one of 2 outcomes, and neither will be pleasant. It's just a matter of when the riots will start. They won't be conservatives either way. Not even far right. They'll be the leftists. And, when I say leftists, I don't mean liberals. It means leftists. A liberal is somebody who, disagrees with what you say, but defends your right to say it. A liberal is a person who wants a little more government rather than private enterprise. And, they agree to disagree, and they have a different view on what works better for the country, what form of, what approach to take. Like in the old days, that's how it was. It was like, we shook hands, if we talked politics, and the idea was that, look, I have a different idea as to how the government should be run as you do, but, at the same time, we both love our country, we want what's best for the United States, so on and so forth. Now, so not talking about liberals, I'm talking about leftists. The communist leftists who burn cities down and openly proclaim, knowingly or not, communism. That's it. Those are the ones. Those are the ones that cause the trouble. If the Supreme Court rules that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did not follow the Constitution, which they likely will, and if they come to conclude that reasonable shenanigans took place in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, at least enough to hold those early morning vote dumps that all happened when we were asleep in the wee hours of Wednesday morning, they'll at least hold those early morning vote dumps suspect. It could virtually undo the entire thing. And that's not craziness, that's just the law, especially in Pennsylvania. Because the state legislature governs the election law. Okay? The Constitution leaves that up to the states. This is 2020. Can you not realize that the Supreme Court overturning an already substantially confusing election that has not been called, except by the media, but it's not been certified by any state? No one's decided who their electors are. Everybody's still trying to figure this out, and there's lawsuits pending. We don't have a president-elect. This is 2020. Can you not realize that that is a possibility? Because if that happens, if it's overturned, riots will start immediately. We all know it. Hopefully the business owners all over the country haven't taken down their plywood yet, because they were ready. You see the footage all over the place. Windows boarded up, shops boarded up, waiting for the riots to happen. Since fellow Republicans began offering their support, the media, which has been at war with the Republican White Houses since the days of Nixon, decided they were going to win the war by declaring Biden victorious. That is their strategy. Make the contester in this case it's President Trump, make him lose on TV. He goes into the legal battles looking as though he's behind. And then they can continue to gaslight those of us who are seeking to investigate the credibility of this election by saying voter fraud never occurs. I mean, for God's sake, Neil Cavuto cut off the White House chief of staff when she began to talk about the cases they have pending in court. Excuse me. I mean, can you? That's amazing. Saying that we can't substantiate those claims. We have to. Well, I can't in good conscience allow this to be reported. We can't substantiate these claims. Well, you know what else you can't substantiate, Neil? You can't substantiate that Biden is the president-elect because the states haven't certified it. Side note, I did a Google search. Let's say SCOTUS does nothing. But, well, we'll get to that in a minute because I do want to say something about this because it ties in with the media here. I did this Google search on Tuesday evening. The kids and I were watching the returns come in early, and we were talking about how late the night could go. And, of course, I talked about 2000 because that was one that I directly experienced. My daughter was voting for the first time in this election. And, of course, 2000, we didn't know because no one truly conceded until the middle of December who the president-elect was going to be. But I brought up 1960, and I explained to the kids that their grandmother was kept up all night by their great-grandmother while the returns came in the Kennedy versus Nixon race, and how it was the closest election up to that point. And, it all kind of boiled down to Chicago. There were, of course, the historical, looking back at it, there were people that said, oh, in Texas, the cattle were voting. In Chicago, the mob, muscled people was rewarding them. There's all kinds of stories out there, but there were a lot of articles that was kind of perceived as a historical, fact. It was just the fact that Nixon didn't challenge it again because, for the good of the country, challenging a race in 1960, ordering a recount. It could have taken months, and they don't have months. Which, by the way, that's why Bush v. Gore ended the way it did, because they didn't get into the legal battle early enough. By the time Gore took it to the courts, the Supreme Court basically looked at the whole thing and said, we need to settle this now. And so they gave it to Bush. And because it appeared that he had the votes. And, Scalia was asked about this, Justice Scalia was asked about that case more than any others, and his answer was always the same. And, God, I miss Scalia. It was always, get over it. Bush v. Gore, get over it. We made the right decision, so there. We didn't interfere. It was brought to us. They brought it to the courts. We decided and get over it. And even if we hadn't, they've counted the votes since then. Different investigative journalists, and it came out the same way. It wouldn't have mattered. But I had shown through a Google search the 1960 election, was showing some articles there about all the corruption and the fraud. And I happened last night to do that search again because I wanted to make a point. One of the kids had asked me about something. He's like, well, what exactly, what was the guy's name, involved in this and that? I did a Google search, and guess what? The articles didn't show up. It's like it had been completely scrubbed. I mean, they were still there. They're still on the internet. It's just I had to go to a great deal of trouble to find them. What came up instead were several articles, partisan articles, from different years, saying the very unpopular position that the voter fraud in 1960 was a myth. I mean, can you believe that? Well, of course we can believe that because it's called big tech. They control what you see, they control what you Google, and that's not a conspiracy theory, that's a fact. Let's say SCOTUS does nothing, which is incredibly possible. They'll just, they basically all but offered with that 4-4 decision to come back after the election. I don't know, I haven't been able to confirm. I understand that Justice Barrett recused herself originally from the 4-4 decision because she said she hadn't had time to read the briefs. I know, of course, several people want her to recuse herself, but there's really no reason for her to. That's up to her. But pretty much the wording of that ruling back then was come back and see us after the election. And the one thing that Bush v. Gore did settle that wasn't 5-4, it was actually 7-2, was the question of which institution should settle a presidential election. In that case, it was the Florida Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court, and it wasn't even close. It was 7-2. So if there's going to be a court that decides who the next president is, it's got to be the Supreme Court. But let's say they do nothing. Let's say they just stay out of it. Let's say the legislatures appoint the electors that have been reported by the news and the states, and the secretaries of state certify the map as it appears now, and Biden becomes president. Guess what? There'll still be riots. They just won't happen right away. Look, leftists are angry even when they win or think they have a win. And when they see that Biden and Harris have no intention of implementing the Bernie Sanders type issues that they promised to, they will riot. And what's going to be really interesting is they won't have Trump to blame. They won't have the orange man bad excuse. So it could potentially even be much worse. Even if Biden and Harris wanted to throw a bone to the leftists, I mean, anything, let's say like, I don't know, 50% forgiveness on your student loans. It's not going to get past the Senate. Nothing's going to pass the Senate. We know now, as of today, the Senate is poised to be 49-48 with the two outstanding votes. One's in Alaska, which is going to be 50, and we have I believe, the Georgia runoff. And even if it were 50-50, I don't necessarily think you'd see Kamala Harris as vice president breaking ties, because we do have, when he's useful, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, who is a Democrat, who, when it gets close to election year, starts caucusing with Republicans. But that's, and really the worst case scenario would be a 50-50. And Manchin, by the way, although he did vote to confirm Justice Kavanaugh, but again, it was because it was right before his election, he did vote guilty in the impeachment case, which kind of surprised me, but he had already been reelected to a 6-year term. He voted against Barrett, but his state, West Virginia, is dark red. And I have a feeling that he is starting to see the writing on the wall. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that a senator decided to jump ship and leave his party, become an independent or the opposition party, or at least become an independent and caucus with the other side. Lieberman did this. He used to caucus with the Democrats. Now he caucuses with the Republicans. It happens. It's happened already to throw the balance off in the Senate in the middle of a Senate term. They'll get nothing, the leftists. They'll get nothing except Biden will probably start a new war. You know, remember those wars? New wars, like, picking an actual fight, sending troops out. I'm not talking about, eliminating a terrorist without dropping any boots on the ground, or, smashing ISIS without, any, marching in the Marines, or, special, the elite forces or Navy SEALs. I'm talking about an actual war, like a new war. And you remember those? Because, we haven't had one in the last 4 years. First time, by the way, I believe, since President Carter, that there was no new war in a president's administration. So if they would somehow defy all odds, again, still talking about the hypothetical of a Biden-Harris administration, if they would somehow defy all odds and gain seats in 2020, or 2022, which is unheard of because the president's party almost always loses seats in the midterm election. But let's say they don't. Let's say they finally get a blue wave in 2022 and they finally have that majority. Any wacky unconstitutional laws they do pass will be immediately challenged in court, and they'll be ignored by the Supreme Court. People always say the Supreme Court strikes it down. That's not actually what they do. They don't strike down laws. They just ignore them. They say, you don't have to follow that law because it's not a legitimate law. It doesn't stand up to it doesn't stand up to the constitutional standard. It's unconstitutional. It's not struck down. They just ignore it. And it'll probably be 5-4. And actually, you know what? The more and more I think about it, if it's a Biden-Harris administration, the Supreme Court will actually probably be 6-3. Because Chief Justice Roberts, he's not a liberal. He's just a neocon Bushite that hates Trump. So, he'll vote against him now because he hates Trump. But otherwise, he tends to come down on the conservative side, except for, of course, a lot of conservatives, call him a traitor because of his stance on Obamacare. He is the swing vote. But for something to be blatantly unconstitutional, he's probably going to side with the conservatives, and so you technically do have a 6-3. If that's what happens, and Joby got, that's the brunt of it. Don't be scared. Don't have the unhealthy, panic, deranged freak out that the other side had with President Trump. Okay? Because you're looking, again, one-term presidency at the most, if he survives 4 years, and, come on. Now, the other thing, Joe Biden becomes our next president. Guess what? I will be the first person to congratulate him. And even more importantly, I'll celebrate the very historic nature of Ms. Harris being the first woman to serve as vice president. Do I like her? No. Do I agree with any of her policies? No. But I won't ignore the significance of it. That's just crazy. But I'm not ready to congratulate anyone yet, because As of this broadcast, there are over 50 sworn affidavits, thousands of witnesses, and all kinds of lawsuits pending. I see Biden trying to be presidential. It's easy for him to say things like, I'll be president for all Americans. His administration will be a do-nothing administration. He won't get his agenda through. He won't get the far-left agenda through. The Senate's not going to cooperate. The judges are ready to fight. Executive orders, are going to be nailed by judges just like they were with Trump, except they're now Trump appointees instead of Obama appointees. And, nothing there, is going to happen. And it's not even certain. It's far from certain. I don't have an outcome to predict. A few days ago, I was still struggling with what's the Supreme Court going to do? What would they say? What would even if they said, conceded, the PA Supreme Court broke the law by extending the deadline when it was the legislature's job. I just figured it was going to be a big so what. Well, they could toss out mail ballots. And if that happens, those of you that were following me on Facebook and following many others were warned. Vote in person. Fauci said it was fine. Put on your mask just like you do to go to the grocery store and go vote. Because if you want it counted, that's the only way you can be sure that it's counted. And that's, provided you fill in the box and, do everything else you're supposed to do. So, this is America. However this ends, the losing side must not, under any circumstances, riot, destroy property, or engage in hysterical behavior. That's not our way. I hope that's not going to be the way it is. I don't believe it will be if Biden's elected. And in fact, as boring as a President Biden's going to be compared to the last 4 years, and a gridlock government, one-term presidency, and an already highly divisive climate, it's not something I'm going to really keen to celebrate, but I'll accept it. I will accept it. And I'll joke about it. In fact, I might even double down and support the winners despite not having elected them, because that's what I did in 96 and 08 and 12, but especially 96, because I wasn't a big Clinton fan until they decided to go after him with all that, Monica Gate stuff. But anyway, there it is, guys and gals. The first political video. Yeah, political. But they won't all be like this. I promise. I'll even mark them first. If you enjoyed my banter, I'd really appreciate it if you go ahead and subscribe. Share it out there. Don't care. This is the Habsburg story, and that's all I've got. Keep breathing and keep living that history.